before taking the usual route, which would be having you
Great to see you too, Vaush.
Having you two introduce yourselves, I have somebody here who will be doing that for us, our hippy dippy ring announcer. Can you take it away?
All right, let's get ready to rumble! Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, envies of all ages, and welcome to tonight's Hippy Dippy Championship match, which promises to be a classic in every sense of the word. Standing in the red corner, representing socialism and weighing in at 170 pounds, the man known only as Vaush, Vaush! And in the blue corner, representing capitalism, weighing in at 165 pounds, 5 ounces, Boss, the Blue Dog, Tiat. And tonight's prize, eternal glory, and a shiny belt.
Thank you so much for being the announcer. Thank you very much. You may exit the arena. You do not get to join a union. Thank you. Okay. Now, I think you all know what you're here for. It is to become the inaugural Hippy Dippy Champion. The topic
I grew out of all my old belts. I'm here to supplement.
Yeah, I have apparently shrunk out of all my old belts, so thanks for that, buddy.
No problem. Now,
I've been absorbing your power.
165 pounds. I mean, that's a good weight.
Yeah, 170 was very generous to me as well.
We here at the Hippy Dippy Championship, we really care about our combatants' public image. So I am just going to make it clear. The topic's simple. Capitalism versus socialism. The prize is simple. This is a no-holds-barred match. I will not be coming in to regulate niceness in any manner. All banned words, except for things that violate Twitch terms of service, have been unbanned. All general hippy-dippy rules have been taken off. Except for the usual, which is, if I speak up, nobody talks over me. I'm just here to regulate, and I would not like to get banned off of the platform. So, with that being said, you will both have a simple introduction time of 2 minutes to hopefully restrain yourself before going head-to-head for the title. We have 3 separate judges. Chat will not get to judge on this occasion. We will have a poll to see who you think won in chat, but it will play nothing more than an advisory role. Okay, is there any questions?
I'm ready.
Wonderful. This is an official Hippy Dippy sanction match for the inaugural Hippy Dippy champion. Whoever wins this will have this actual belt mailed to them. It took about 4 months to schedule this match. Due to recent events, it was a little harder to get going than would have thought. And of course, it has costs. If everybody at home would like to support the show, I would deeply appreciate it, either through subs or donations. This match is a go. 1 second, let me ring the bell, and I will let Bastiat start with his introduction at first. You may begin.
All right. So, folks, my name is Bastiat. I am a liberal, and I believe in liberal democracy as a system of government with a capitalist economy. What do I mean by a capitalist economy? I mean an economy which exists predominantly as it exists in the developing world today, or rather the developed and largely developing world today. That is, say, an economy developed and defined by private property, self-interest and the profit motive, competition, a market mechanism, the freedom to choose with respect to consumption, production, and investment by the individual, and, of course, a relatively limited role of government. Government is, of course, essential for capitalism, but what I mean when I talk about a limited role for government is that it respects that there is a delineation between the private sphere and the public sphere. Right? It does not seek to completely absorb, to completely politicize, to completely dominate the economic sphere. So that is where I come from. I believe that, generally speaking, capitalism is the best way people have yet discovered to improve living standards, to improve quality of life, and generally to make it possible for all of us to do the things we want to do in our lives as individual human beings. I believe, in contrast, that the brand of socialism that Vaush proposes fundamentally, at best, makes no sense, and at worst, might well be something approaching incoherence. He talks about the idea of democracy in the workplace. He talks about the idea of decommodification. But then he simultaneously says that social democracy is basically a sinkhole, and then talks about how his long-term goal is for the workers to seize the means of production, presumably through some sort of violent revolution. And in the long run, I don't understand how he can say that social democracy, that the societies we are in today, and that exist, whether it be the United States, whether it be the Nordic countries, all across the developed world, that have shown people the way to development, to high human development indexes, to growing standards of living, how he can reject all of that, for some unproven idea of market socialism, which, though it has been tried rarely, where it has been tried, chiefly in the former Yugoslavia, has really delivered relatively diminishing returns. So I have to say, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I look forward to hearing in what sense it would work, how it would work, and in particular, I look forward to hearing his explanation for how it would work better than what we've got now. Because fundamentally, my goal is individual freedom and the results that come through a capitalist economy, the improving standard of living that I think has made the world a better place, particularly over the last, say, 40 years. So that's where I stand.
Wonderful. Next, I will be throwing it over to Vaush for a similarly timed intro.
Yeah. So nobody is satisfied with the world as it exists. Everybody wants to make some improvements, and everybody wants to make those improvements in certain ways. Some improvements, if made in ineffectual ways, will beget negative results, and some negative directions. Oh, hold on. I hear an echo.
I'll mute my mic.
Okay, gotcha. And some directions one can pursue, even if well-intentioned, lead to negative outcomes. In my personal opinion, I believe that which I advocate for principally, that is to say selective decommodification and for market socialism, worker cooperatives, are incredibly empirically defensible, which is what I believe distinguishes me and the things that I advocate for from many other leftists online. When we speak of selective decommodification, we are speaking of no more than that which has been proven to be effective in Nordic democracies. When we say, and you as a capitalist should know this, that there are certain industries which do not respond very well to shifts in demand. They do not appropriately respond to market conditions. We know there are issues with American healthcare. We know there are issues with the decentralization of transportation networks that can be fixed with government intervention. Now, you said that you do not want the government to walk in and completely seize control of private life, and I could not agree with you further. It is freedom which I am principally concerned with. It is through freedom which I believe equality can be gained, not the other way around. Equality does not beget freedom, but freedom certainly can beget equality if appropriately structured. And I believe that selective decommodification, giving people the freedom to enjoy good health care or the freedom to develop urban environments in a way which allows them to go from A to B without the need for a car, or anything else which could benefit from government intervention. These are things which enhance human freedom. Now, to speak of market socialism, when we talk about worker cooperatives, it is true that Yugoslavia had its problems, but I think there were plenty of problems with Yugoslavia which did not begin and end with their market socialism-driven economy. There were plenty of other conditions, and to me it is as ridiculous to decry market socialism because of Yugoslavia as it would be to decry capitalism because of the Congo and the Congo exclusively, or because of certain sections of Africa or Southeast Asia. There are other socio-political conditions which influence the development of these economies in those areas, but market socialism at its core is essentially a government-facilitated operation of worker cooperatives across the breadth of the economy. The government expects this be the standard form of governance. And there is a great deal of empirical evidence suggesting that worker cooperatives are not just functional, not just effective, but in cases sometimes more functional and more effective than traditionally operated private firms. And the reason for that is, and I'll wrap up with this, democracy is important. Freedom is important. And in my mind, democracy and what we consider to be democracy has been evolving for a long time now. It used to be only landowning white males, and today we have many more. But I think that in 100 years, economic democracy will be that point where we look back on the past and smack our foreheads and say, why didn't we do that sooner?
Okay, the match is live. You may engage. I gotta use the bathroom, so no steel chairs. I'll be right back.
So what I don't understand is how you can write off the social democracies in one sense. When you say, for example, that they are sinkhole, that basically in your discussion with Hakeem in February, or rather in January of this year, you said these cannot work unless they depend upon, unless they benefit from foreign exploitation. I mean, that is your position, is it not?
Right, of course. Capitalism necessarily relies on some economic underclass. You have it domestically with slaves, or you have it abroad with sweatshop workers, but it has to exist somewhere.
How can you make the argument that, first of all, that sweatshop workers are in any way comparable to slaves, in the sense that sweatshop workers overseas who have managed to take jobs as a result of foreign investment that pay more than they would otherwise receive in their domestic economies are engaged in something tantamount to slavery? First of all,
in the sense that they're
absolutely, I mean, you got to think about what it is you're comparing to. You've got to think about what the best alternative is. If private employment in a factory is still the better alternative to what existed before, that foreign investment is not some kind of slavery. I'll absolutely bite the bullet on this. That foreign investment is a step forward.
I didn't say it was slavery, and it's certainly the case that sweatshops are preferable to subsistence farming. No, I said that it was an economic underclass, and I stand by that point. Whereas before, we were able to have the worst jobs done by people who were sold and bought as chattel. Nowadays, we ship off the worst jobs to places that have lower standards of labor and lower minimum wages. That's absolutely, undeniably how this works.
What do you mean by the worst jobs? What are the worst jobs to you?
The jobs that we would best benefit from exporting to other countries.
I mean, factory jobs?
Sure, but not just factory jobs. Factory jobs that have low pay and low workers' rights. You can get more money. You can exploit more wealth out of the labor of sweatshop workers than you can out of union-enrolled American factory workers. That's why we do it. That's why we move these jobs overseas, isn't it?
Absolutely. And yet, the people who receive those jobs are still benefiting comparable to what they would otherwise have. On the one hand, they do better, for example, than the subsistence farming that they had in China prior to the industrialization of that country, chiefly driven
Is that the limit?
By foreign. That's the start. The limit is, where you go from there. But that's certainly the start. And it's important to remember that the start is important, because that is something that you would basically put an end to, if you could, in your ideal world, through your argument that social democracy, the kind of economy that I advocate for, not social democracy, but an economy with a welfare state, things like that, that basically depends on fundamentally unfair and destructive relationships to third world countries instead
do you think it's possible?
Mutually beneficial relationships?
The myth of mutually beneficial relationships relies on the assumption that there's no implicit coercion in an economic transaction. It's entirely possible. It's entirely possible for two entities to benefit from a transaction, but the way in which that transaction is taking place begets not only a disproportionate benefit from one side, but also with one side controlling the terms of that engagement. So, for example, the United States of America, or if we want to talk broadly, Western capitalist countries, have an overwhelming amount of economic power globally, which we wield through institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, which you can say they force these changes. You can say they encourage these changes. They encourage reforms which make these countries more susceptible to our business interests. Now, is it preferable to have sweatshop labor instead of subsistence farming? In most cases, yes. Not always. There's nuance there, but often, yes. But that doesn't mean there wasn't a better alternative. Much in the same way that it is entirely possible to take a starving orphan in from the street and feed them nothing but peanuts. I mean, that's better than them starving on the street. That you've improved their life. There's no denying that. But you're only feeding them peanuts. You got oranges in the fridge.
I don't want to feed my kid only peanuts. But at the same time, I don't want to say something like, well, is that the best we can do, without providing an example, an alternative, something that is based in some kind of empirical reality that we can say, okay, this is the best alternative. It's very easy to criticize. Indeed, there's a lot to criticize about modern capitalism in the United States and around the world. And yet the real question must always be, what is your better alternative? Because right now, in the broad sweep of human history, foreign trade, foreign investment, through market mechanisms, through competitive capitalism, seems to be the best way that we have yet discovered to reduce poverty, not only in the developed world, but in the developing world. And when we have the resources to combine that with a welfare state of some size, you want probably a bigger one than I do, but we both want one of some sort, right? Once you have those resources, you can build that welfare state. You can drive human prosperity forward. And what you're saying here, when you argue that social democracy depends on unequal exchange, exploitation, it's fundamentally destructive of the people, of the third world.
Now that's all capitalism, not just.
Not only is it false, the idea that our economies depend on this foreign trade. For example, the United States, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, benefits from foreign trade to the extent of 2 to 8% of GDP. we'd close ourselves off from the world, and though we would suffer a decline in our standard of living, our economy, as it exists today, does not in any way depend on the existence of foreign trade. Even if we end it all, tomorrow, and I'll send you the link. But that's the benefit of foreign trade to the United States. That is what all this has brought to the United States: 2 to 8% increase in GDP.
But you're free to, but from everything that I've seen, I'm pretty sure that pretty much every country, every developed country at the very least, relies on global trade. I mean, that's the reason why our economies have developed the way we are. We've exported a massive amount of industrial work. We don't even get our resources domestically. I'm pretty sure that without, we can, so these are empirical points that we can discuss the particulars on later, because whether or not America depends on
You're just disagreeing with the evidence, Vaush. I mean, it's one thing to say that, yes, trade is very important. Of course it's important. It is important for the purpose of improving our standard of living, making it higher than it would otherwise be. But the developed world could exist without the trade of the developing world. Now, not universally in the sense of, there are some resources perhaps at one time in the past or another, but the idea that we need this trade. All right, your argument is that we.
No, wait, hold on. I'll tell you. Wait. I'll tell you my argument, because we're running off in a couple of
exploitative trade.
We're running off in a couple of points here. First of all, and again, this is tangential, but I'm highly skeptical of the claim that we're only engaging in foreign trade for marginal benefits. I'm pretty sure that we benefit pretty tremendously from our ability to participate in the global economy, but it's ultimately secondary to my argument, because I would like it if our countries were more capable of economic independence. We're talking about two separate things right now. We're talking about domestically worker cooperatives and what that can do, and we have plenty of empirical evidence suggesting those could be an improvement, at least in certain respects. But globally, we know that the reason why these countries are the way they are is because it's incentivized for them to facilitate the growth of their economy in ways that benefit our industry. If a country, a developing country, not very wealthy, not very powerful, needs money, and it certainly does in a very aggressive foreign marketplace, the best way for it to get that money, the best way for it to get its security, is to kowtow to Western business interests to make sure that they're capable of signing off their wealth of labor, their resources, to foreign companies. That way, not only do they get whatever money we give to them on account of that trade, but they also get the security of being essentially backed by Western business interests, which means that if they get invaded or if there's instability there, we have an incentive to involve ourselves in that process. This has absolutely happened before. I don't know why you're shaking your head. What
I don't understand is you seem to be under this assumption, right, that the United States as a whole pushes trade like as some kind of unified whole, right, because it is so very important to us, and other countries in return are engaging in trade because they believe that they will get military protection or something like that, when in reality what's going on
we
is
try to maximize our benefit.
Right. We as individuals try to maximize our benefit. That 2 to 8% of GDP is a whole lot more than 2 to 8% benefit with respect to the people who do engage in foreign trade. With respect to not only domestic trade, and I sent you the source if you want to take a look, you can check out, whatever. I sent to the chat that you mean, Dylan, right? It's a big benefit for the people who directly engage in it, absolutely, and it is a benefit to society as a whole. The question, though, I think that seems to me to break your worldview here, is that you say that our standard of living, a welfare state, all the good things that we both agree in some fashion we want here in the United States. I don't want to go as far as you do, but you seem to say that they depend on us being fundamentally monsters, right? We have to exploit in a destructive fashion the developing world.
You're assigning some moralistic language to me that I try to avoid when I make these arguments.
When you talk about social democracy as a sinkhole, when you talk about it as depending on exploitation of the third world, what else can that mean?
So wait, to be perfectly clear, the reason why I said that about social democracies is because, I think they're certainly preferable to what we have in America right now. They don't overcome some of the fundamental flaws that I believe we have right now, morally, with how we engage with the economy. Right now, well, no, not just right now. All the time, everywhere, countries and individuals are looking to maximize their own interests. Sometimes they do that through, Henry Ford, for example, paid his workers more because he realized that once they made enough money to buy his cars, everybody benefited from the transaction.
That's false.
Wonderful.
That's not at all true. That wouldn't even make sense. How could he pay his own workers for the sole purpose of them buying his own cars? That's a very small part of the economy. That's one of those myths people tell for the sake of trying to raise the idea of wages being good and going up organically. But Henry Ford didn't raise his employees' wages so they could buy cars. It would be a kind of endless cycle. That's like plugging in an electrical outlet into an electrical socket on the same extension cord and thinking you've created infinite energy. I mean, there's
Wait,
no,
I'm sorry.
no
Wait,
sense
hold
to
on.
it.
Hold on. So I learned that in history class. If that's some mythical fable, that's entirely
it's a
possible. I
it's
have
a
to have
fable.
double check. But that was an incredibly silly thing that you just said. The
It's
idea that
an
paying
argument.
paying your workers enough that they can
Yes.
purchase the products that you develop is not like plugging an electrical cord into the socket that you put it from at all. There are absolutely economic benefits to making sure that like the swath of the population is capable of actually participating in the economy to the
Sure.
extent that they can buy the products you're producing.
But that's very
We all
different from what
benefit
you
when people make
described. I mean, you described a situation where he raised their wages so that they could buy his products. If you're saying you want to make products that many people can afford, sure, absolutely, that's good.
No,
But he didn't raise their wages so they could buy
as I
the
understood, he raised their wages because he realized that if they were capable of living a more comfortable existence, then they would also be capable of purchasing his products. So more of the money would go back to him. In essence, he would make money off of it because their standard of living would be raised for what was essentially them taking a cut to their wages.
He raised wages
That
to
was
prevent
as I was
turnover.
told.
You know.
Anyway, this is highly tangential. When we're talking about social democracies and we're talking about their reliance on developing world labor, the only reason this was fundamentally brought up is because it was taking place in the context of a larger conversation about what can be done to facilitate the proper and humane economic growth of developing nations. So, to my mind, the best thing that we could do realistically, not snap our fingers God mode, but realistically, would probably be international trade blocks that we could use to sort of push up the standard of living in these countries by saying, I'm not going to do business in a country that has, these types of labor rules. We're not going to do business in a country that has a standard of living this low. And that sort of thing would incentivize these countries to ratchet up their internal, standard of living without it compromising the business relationships they have with the global north.
And I agree that that would be great. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, blessed Hillary Clinton, if only she had won and been able to implement that, that would have been wonderful. And yet, alas, we didn't get it because we got a candidate who wanted more economic independence. I don't understand how you can say you want more global trade blocks when you just said a moment ago that you want more economic independence for countries.
I want countries to be able to be economically independent, but I think that global necessary. It also helps facilitate peacetime. The more countries engage in global trade with one another, the less of an incentive there is to engage in boots on the ground war with any developing countries.
I mean, that's certainly a good thing, but something else really surprised me with respect to your idea of development and improvement in the third world is that on top of the idea that, and it seems like sometimes you want these countries to be able to seal themselves off, right, from the United States. Part of the long-term plan you discussed with Hakeem on January
Sometimes
4th
that
was
can
this
be to their benefit,
idea, was this idea that over the long run, countries should experience revolution. They should basically stop trading with the United States until at some day in the future, first the countries of the developing world fall to bits, and then eventually the United States falls to some kind of revolution from the developing world. I mean, that was the plan you laid out, and that seems very different from this idea of, well, let's have more trade, though. I mean, that's good. Right? How can you hold both of those opinions at the same time?
Easily. Selective protectionist policies for developing countries can be very beneficial. We know this because of the Asian tigers. We know this from countries all around the world. Even America during the Gilded Age engaged in some pretty substantial protectionist policies, which can be effective. Now, America currently is the leader of global trade. I don't think we're in a position to meaningfully benefit from protectionist policies. But if there are small countries like, for example, Bolivia, which just returned its IMF loan, who say, no, we do not want to engage in these reforms. We do not want to submit ourselves to the business interests of the Western world. We will find the way to develop our economy on our own. There are countries that are better for that strategy.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess to the extent that you think countries should be free to refuse IMF loans, I mean, sure, they should be free to refuse IMF loans, as they always have been, right? That's never been, like, there are conditions countries may find themselves in where an IMF loan is a lot better than the alternative, but the IMF loan has never been forced to
This is what I mean about coercion, though, Bastiat. If a country is desperately poor, because of war and civil conflict, and then the IMF shows up and they're like, we'll give you $100 million as long as you neoliberalize your economy. This is a coercive engagement.
But for you to define that as coercion, to say that somebody shows up with a $100 million loan, no force required to force that loan on you. They offer you the option in exchange for reform. It is not a libertarian argument. Vaush, your definition of coercion basically means that nobody can ever engage in any kind of independent agency of any kind so long as scarcity exists in some form. I mean, it's a ridiculous notion to call that coercion.
scarcity will always
exist.
compel some degree of coercion. There's no denying that there's always going to be some
Gosh.
element of that. But if you don't believe there's any fundamentally coercive element to like war-torn, poor, ravaged countries with desperate populations being offered loans as long as they're willing to succumb to Western business interests, if you don't think that's a interaction which has some degree of coercion, of implicit force behind it, then I don't know what you're even talking about. We can talk about the coconut on the island analogy if you really want to.
We can talk about the coconut on the island analogy if you want to.
Sure, well, then I ask you, we don't even have to talk about analogy.
I don't think that's really an analogy that ends very well for anybody who's ever heard of it before and had a minute to think about it. I mean, the idea that that proves something, the idea that two people on a desert island arguing over a stack of fruit proves something meaningful about the global economy is ridiculous. The only reason that analogy works is because you talk to a lot of ANCAPs who are, frankly, ridiculous. Right?
I don't know. These arguments you're making sound fairly ridiculous.
If you're saying to me,
run by it. Wait, then overcome the analogy.
Yeah, if you're saying what you're saying is that fundamentally it is coercion. Anytime somebody has resources, somebody else wants those resources and they cannot get those resources easily except if they go through another person. It's like saying, basically, it's like if I told you, Vaush, you see, your idea of economic democracy is all well and good, but if we crash on a desert island and three of us decide to form a coconut co-op, and two of us say, you ain't going to get that. Would you
like to get to the analogy yet?
You ain't going to get that third coconut. Yeah, I mean, you get where I'm going here. It's ridiculous. I mean,
I don't think that the analogy that I don't think your deconstruction of my example
isn't going to work.
Very prescient. So hold on.
All right, go for it.
Right. You fly a plane, well, you're not flying. Plane crashes, desert island. You wake up, but somebody else, the only other survivor, woke up before you.
Yeah.
And they have collected all the coconuts, the only food sources on the island. They have them. They're theirs now. And they say they'll provide you coconuts so long as you suck their dick.
Yeah.
Now, the only question is, do you consider this a coercive exchange?
No. It's no more. No, it's not.
Really?
The fact that resources are limited, that somebody else got those resources first and doesn't want to give them to you does not mean they're coercing you by saying, I will give those resources to you in exchange for that. Any more than it's a legitimate example to say that three people crash on the island, two of them decide that the worker coconut co-op that they are going to form, now that they got three people, will only share the coconuts if they, that's the thing, right? There's no coercion in the situation for one. Right.
So wait, what does coercion mean to you? Wait. What does coercion mean to you?
Coercion is when you use force to deprive someone of something, right? To force them to do something. Not when you dangle something at them.
I'm sorry. What about teachers having sex with their students, Bastiat?
Yeah, that's rape. That's wrong. It's rape.
Wait, Bastiat, hold on. You're unironically like being loud and angry. So let's talk about it, okay? So a kid has a certain grade, not kid, let's say college, okay? Let's say a college student has a certain grade and the teacher kind of suggests, that if they stay after class and make some amends, that maybe the grade can go up, but they don't demand anything. They don't pull out a gun. They don't threaten anything. Is that not coercion in a comparable way? I would say it's coercion because the teacher has an undue amount of power over the student that they can use to press the student into a disadvantageous exchange. Even if the student believes it's something that they want to do, it doesn't change the fact that the teacher is wielding power in an undue way.
And power is something that all of us wield every day in all kinds of different forms. And when you say that it's coercion, first of all, what you've described, no, I don't think it's inherently wrong. I don't think it's inherently wrong for somebody who has more resources to offer to share those resources with somebody in exchange for some kind of benefit. That's what you're basically deeming
So you're okay with teachers?
No, Vaush, I'm not okay with that. And again, the fact that you have to retreat. No, the fact that you have to retreat. It's not retreating. If you're saying
you don't believe in coercion as a concept.
No, I don't, Vaush. I described what coercion is to you, and you were describing something very different. But let me lay out a response to what you're saying, right? Trading grades for sex, right? That's basically between two otherwise adults, right? They're adults in this situation. Yeah, I again, if you're trading sex for money, if you're trading sex for, something else that is legal or reasonable, again, all other factors out of the mind, no. I don't find that coercion to offer that.
Then why do you keep saying you do find it coercive, but then you explain it, and then you say you don't find it coercive?
Because what you originally described, a teacher having sex with their student, to me, that sounds inherently like rape because I'm thinking of like an elementary, high school.
College. So you think it's okay if it's college?
No, it's not okay for a variety of reasons, but it's not like coercion. I don't agree with that.
Wait,
There
if
are
it's not
practical reasons
coercion,
to
then what about it is wrong?
We don't want an academic system that is that where grades mean nothing.
Wait. Hold on.
Coercive?
Teachers
No.
will offer extra credit all the time. Like,
Yeah, is that-
you
yeah,
can,
is
if you
that
talk with a teacher, you
coercion?
can redo tests
Yeah.
that you flunked
Right.
on. Like, there are ways to get around that. So why is the sex element wrong, if not coercion?
No, it would be wrong.
Wait, I'm sorry. I'm letting you dictate the conversation a little bit too much. Hold on, Bastiat, just a moment. Very kindly.
You dictated the conversation by bringing up Coconut Island and sex and rape while we were talking about the more salient point that you.
The problem, Bastiat, is you legitimately don't understand what coercion means.
Vaush, you've got a very different idea of what coercion is. That basically means that all human exchanges, right, are fundamentally coercive, and it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense.
There is an element of coercion in most human interactions, but some are worse than others. This is absolute. This is our understanding of coercion with regard to a wide variety of social issues.
Power imbalances.
Hold on. It's not surprising to me that you would be attached to capitalism as a system if you're incapable of recognizing that there's something fundamentally unfair about exchanges of resources where only one party in that exchange is. Wait, really quick. Why do you keep interrupting me with yeah and sure?
Well, because what you were saying here right now is, again, another ridiculous kind of attack where you say,
talking about the definition of coercion,
why you're okay with coercion, or I understand why you're okay with capitalism, but you can't even understand your definition of coercion.
I need you to calm down a little bit, Bastiat, okay? And because you're actually like chirping every moment that I speak. It's actually really distracting.
What you're doing here is so ridiculously unfair.
Coercion begins. Well, I've had this conversation a lot, and usually even ANCAPs don't bite the bullet on the idea that there's no such thing as coercion without direct force.
Can you define coercion then?
Yeah, I think that coercion is, well, you have explicit and implicit coercion. And explicit coercion, I think, would be like bullet to the head, like gun to the head, like, very obvious. But implicit coercion is when there is a power balance or a power imbalance, between two or more entities, which means that there's not really a way to fairly dictate the terms of an engagement between them. An example of this would be unionization. The reason we have unions is because collective bargaining is the only way that workers can actually like barter for their salaries up next to a corporation. People, boomers, mind, have been saying for decades, you need to go in there, you need to tell them what you're worth, okay? Tell them what you want to be paid. This doesn't work. Unions work because through collective bargaining, you're able to bolster yourself. You're able to make yourself stronger. And that's the way you make that interaction more fair. Only through unions can we even arrive at what a capitalist would consider a fair wage for a worker. Because otherwise, if corporations had all the whim, then they would just take the governments and take the entire economy and pay everyone exactly what they needed to not starve. It's only through power on the end of the workers that we can arrive at a fair, even by a capitalist standard, end. So with all of that being said, how can you not see, even if you believe that ultimately they do good, which you can bite the bullet on that too, how can you not see that the IMF and the World Bank have a coercive relationship with the developing countries they offer loans to?
Because I suppose we've got a fundamentally different idea of what coercion is. And let me tell you why your definition here of coercion is basically a power imbalance, where you can have either explicit or implicit coercion is such an issue to me, all right? The reason this is such an issue to me is that it seems to water down the very idea of real coercion, which to me is force, right? Violence, or the threat of violence, the threat of doing some kind of violence against somebody, right? As a way to get somebody to do an act, right? I don't see how you can say that that a power imbalance can be coercion, because power imbalances, one, exist throughout all life. There are always imbalances of resources, or always imbalances of power, and to say that those are all fundamentally coercive seems to me to invite the kind of action that it seems to invite to me real coercion, which is, say, state force. Like, for example, when you say that there's coercion in this situation, when you say that trading sex for something, perhaps trading sex for money, is fundamentally coercive, that to me is the kind of argument that people use then as an argument to abolish things like sex work, rather than to have these things decriminalized or
when did I make
legalized,
that
right?
argument? Wait, I'm pro-sex.
Wait, give me a moment. I just wanted to clarify coercion quick with an example. Let's say one of you, before the fight, came up to me and said, I will pay you $1,000 if you give me the belt. Is that coercion?
No, it's a trade.
Well, I don't think it would be necessarily coercion, because it would. I don't.
Why not?
Wait, hold on. Aren't you literally homeless right now?
Yeah, I mean, that seems like, that
No,
would be
that could be coercive, though it would be over a relatively trivial thing. Yeah, because
Yeah, I
you can
mean,
make the argument that you'd be extolling something from you that you would otherwise not be willing to.
the difference between, I
Trade.
think, Vaush and I is that I believe coercion is basically kind of a 1 or 0 situation here, whereas in Vaush's situation, it seems like it's sort of a sliding scale that depends perhaps on the numbers involved, the role of somebody.
How
in
do
a
you feel
particular
about bosses
situation.
flirting with their coworkers, or sorry, with their subordinates in a workplace?
Yeah, I mean, that's bad for a variety of reasons, right? It's
Why?
something that I'm glad we have a state policy against, but to say that that's inherently,
Why?
say that's coercion, right? I don't agree. That is that is exploiting a relationship that exists, but to say that is coercion and force when, ultimately
how is
you
it
can leave the
exploitative?
workplace.
Wait, how is it?
You are, first of all, this is again derailing into the issue of coercion, which
It's
we can keep on doing if you
absolutely
like.
not a derailing.
Keep on doing, right? But ultimately, I mean, the idea that it is coercion, if you offer to trade something, right, in exchange for something else, that's not coercion. Coercion requires
Flirting
a threat,
with
right?
a
It
subordinate.
requires a threat of violence of some kind, right? In a situation
Flirting
like
with
that,
the
no,
subordinate,
right?
is that coercive?
No. That is something that is
Okay.
bad for a variety of
would be
reasons.
willing to
It
bet
might depend. It might depend, by the way, on how it's done, right? If you are doing
I have
something that makes
never
somebody
met
feel
a
like they are in fear of
person-
violence,
I have
no.
never met a person who used the term coercion in the way that you do, and in fact, the way you're using it is, in my mind, so objectively incorrect. And I'm a linguistic descriptivist, so I hate
Sure.
saying this, but I feel that I could find people talking about any of these issues using the word coercion. If I found like press statements or
Sure.
like public figures talking about
Yeah.
sexual harassment at the workplace, if I talk about any of these issues, or when I talk about like teachers flirting with students or anything like that,
Sure.
coercion would come up very, very frequently. Like that term would come up very often.
And
This
you
is
can-
reaching
yeah.
the point where I actually wonder if you're engaging in like a bad faith argument, because you know that if you acknowledge that coercion can involve like an unfair power dynamic between two individuals or two entities, that you would have to bite the bullet in a lot of my
Vaush,
other arguments.
I don't bite the bullet. I'm not being bad faith. You basically pointed out that there are a lot of other people who accept an inconsistent definition of coercion.
It's not inconsistent.
There's a difference between
just because
imbalance
you don't
and power
understand it
relations
doesn't mean it's
and
inconsistent.
coercion, right? No, just because I'm proposing a consistent
inconsistency?
definition here. Your idea of coercion depends entirely on the situation and has no objective
Power
reality.
dynamics.
That is why
On
you come
power
to a situation. Yeah, power dynamics, right? So you're saying basically that the ridiculous conclusion that you get out of the examples you keep providing is that if a loan, or that if the IMF shows up and says, we will give you $100 million if you decide to follow some conditions that we will not force you to do, but we will give you $100 million. Well, hey, that's coercion, right? Even though a country has been offered $100 million they wouldn't otherwise have. That's why your ridiculous definition of coercion is a problem. Because
we haven't even settled on the fundamental definition.
Sounds real good on the level.
Weinstein's victims
in reality
coerced?
here.
Couldn't they have just like left?
Vaush, what if you want to talk about examples
definition of coercion is empty, Bastiat. Nobody is stupid enough to believe the definition the way you're using it. It's power dynamics, and you keep claiming that it's inconsistent. How is it inconsistent?
A fundamental difference between somebody like Harvey Weinstein, all right, who would, for example, do something, or like Matt Lauer, or these people who literally would lock doors and rape people, and somebody saying that in this hypothetical situation,
there were plenty of people who were just like flirted and pressed on. But hey, isn't that Weinstein's right as like a citizen?
To be clear, touching somebody without their consent is violence, is coercion, is all that. Yeah, you can't.
It wasn't just that though. There were a lot of people who just had like really inappropriate relations, or
I agree. Relations are inappropriate. They're bad. They're not coercion though. There's a difference.
Interesting.
I acknowledge that there are difference between meanings of words.
What is the inconsistency with the definition of coercion?
Because the inconsistency of the definition of coercion that you use leads to, first of all, you've accused me of being bad faith several times here. When I'm explaining,
you were mad before then. First of all, it was one. Second of all, you were mad before then. Come on, you were mad before then.
If you're going to resort to "you're mad" because I basically cornered you on the
you're
fact,
actually shouting over me.
I cornered you. First of all, all right, let's cool off for a little bit here because you've started to get mad. All right. Let's cool off a little bit here.
Well, I apologize for my inappropriate behavior.
You've repeatedly responded, all right, to issues I brought up by bringing up ridiculous examples like Coconut Island or rape this or rape that, whereas I'm making a simple point to you that fundamentally the idea that coercion means just a power imbalance of any kind, right, is a ridiculous definition that means nothing.
Okay.
It
All right,
means
so
that
maybe we should move away from the term
coercion.
coercion. Maybe we should move away from the term. So let's get at the raw idea underneath it, okay? So I'm going to bring up another example. It's not a debate tactic. I genuinely want your answer, but I'm going to move forward with that answer, okay? So let's say you're out in the town, you want to get your dick sucked, as one does, you know.
Bosh.
Wait,
Is this capitalism and socialism?
Genuinely, hold on. I genuinely need an answer to this.
Okay.
Because
Is this how you're going to implement socialism in the world? Is through one ridiculous dick-sucking example after the next?
Well,
that shows how empty the ideas you've got are.
That
You
has
haven't
nothing
proposed
to do.
anything in response yet, other than to fixate on the idea that what I proposed here, that the IMF offering a loan is the same as Harvey Weinstein raping somebody in their office. And
So we're going to try to get to that. If we actually can sit still, we'll find a way to connect these ideas.
What do you mean sit still? I've been trying to go back to trade for the last 10 minutes, and you keep wanting to talk about people getting their dick sucked. It's ridiculous.
We're going to move away from the term coercion, okay? So let's say that
Vaush, we're going to debate capitalism and socialism. All right. And if you want to talk about capitalism and socialism, we can do that.
Well. I didn't realize that I was working with a person who didn't use words the way that I use them. So I'm trying to fix that. So let's say you're out in the town and you want to get your dick sucked. You find a homeless person. They don't look well. And you toss $100. You toss 520s on them and you say, hey, those are yours if you suck my dick. So you don't think that's coercive because it's a trade, blah, blah. Do you think, do you think there's anything wrong with that? Apart from, I guess, public indecency, which would be the dick sucking. But do you think there's anything wrong with that exchange?
I think that is, I think it's pretty miserable that is basically the option that this person has. But in terms of like that being morally wrong, no. I mean, morally wrong, somebody has traded $100 in exchange for an act. Both parties are consenting. Both parties are better off. I don't like it. That's certainly not my ideal. I wouldn't say yes. That would be the best thing, right? That'd be the best thing we could do for the poor, right? But then again, I mean, if your belief is that fundamentally social democracy is exploitative of the entire
wait, hold on. We're almost there.
I suppose throwing somebody $100 is at least a domestic harm alone.
We're almost there. Right? So you don't think it's morally wrong, but you think it's a miserable state of affairs.
Sure.
So would you agree then that even if an exchange between two entities of different power levels led to a benefit for both sides, that there may be still some underlying thing there, some cause to that imbalance that might be worth addressing?
Sure. Yeah. That as I've said, people who are poor should, benefit from welfare programs. There should be options for people and all that.
Great. Then you agree with my argument, which is that right now, subsistence farming is worse than sweatshop labor, but we should do something to systemically address the fact that these developing nations essentially have no economic alternative but to whore themselves out to Western capitalism. You agree with my argument?
Yeah, I agree that we should strive to improve standards of living. I agree that we should do things like, for example, engage in global trade. What I don't agree is that example right there does anything to support your underlying argument, right?
I never wanted to make sure you understood. I just wanted to make sure that you believed there was something wrong with the fact that developers have to rely on these systems. But you do, so now we can move forward.
No. This is a very important point now that you've made, right? Because I am the one here saying that global trade is a good thing. I am the one saying that global trade is wonderful and it benefits both parties. And yet you're the one saying at the end of the day, hey, you know what? Maybe we should have, support revolutions overseas, right? We should support violent terrorists.
Well, we haven't gotten to that.
That would attack civilian populations. Instead of having, well, that's what violent terrorist communist revolutionaries do. That's what the Red Army faction did in Germany.
Hold on. You're pumping a lot of adjectives in there. You're sounding like a neocon complaining about Islamicists, okay?
Gosh, let's roll back just a bit.
So we've agreed. So we both like global trade and we both want to improve the poor people in the developing world. That's wonderful.
We do not both like global trade. I like global trade. You like global trade. You like global trade based on the argument and based on who you are talking to. In the discussion you had all the time. In the discussion you had with Hakeem on January 4th, you made it quite clear. You made it quite clear that you like global trade some of the time. But really what you're interested in is in revolution and in supporting revolution wherever possible overseas by whatever means. And you are open to and indeed interested in these countries eventually stopping trade with the United States altogether.
So first of all, those aren't mutually exclusive. So I don't know why you're adding them like they're a juxtaposition.
How can you do the two of those at once?
Hold on. I like some types of global trade. There are some types of global trade that I dislike because I think they're coercive. Now, there are some types of protectionism that I think are beneficial, but these are usually in the case of really struggling developing nations that are getting exploited by their neighbors or by Western imperialism or neo-imperialism. And I think that in those cases, it can be beneficial. Even America sometimes could benefit from some degrees of protectionism, though I am generally a globalist in this respect. So with all that being said, I'm unquestionably a fan of global trade, so long as I think it's serving the interests of the global working population.
Right.
Now, with regards to this revolution terrorist cell thing,
Right.
I am of the opinion, and we haven't even gotten to the empirics of the benefits of socialism. But hold on, if you were to decommodify a country entirely right now, it would be cut off from the rest of the world in trade, because the only real market right now is participating in capitalism. This is one of the reasons why the Soviet Union had their own trade blocks, and they had difficulty getting resources sometimes because, America mostly dominated the world market. So I'm not of the opinion that you can beget socialism just by cutting America off from the world, making it a socialist country. We would get invaded, we would get censored, we would get blockaded. It would be bad. So instead, what I think that we should do is we should encourage economic strength and independence, not complete protectionism, but the ability to be independent in countries around the world. And then, should the opportunity for them to go socialist arise, since they have less to lose by removing themselves from the global market for a time, we as leftists in America should encourage our government to not kill their leaders and bomb their countries and forests and drop Agent Orange over their rain fields.
Raj, I think, first of all, I think you've really soft-pedaled what it is you described there. You were talking about how it would be absolutely appropriate, if you could do it, to attack the United States military, to attack American interests abroad, to do all of those kinds of things. So it's not just
American
a matter of keeping the United States.
People.
Hey,
Can other countries not defend themselves against America?
And that's absolutely, if you think a country should, absolutely, a country should be able to defend itself. Absolutely, anybody has a right to defend themselves against violence. I don't think anybody should submit to the mob. But I will say this: what you're talking
I don't think you understand that.
What you're talking about, what you're talking about here, Vaush, is basically you're saying it seems like you're trying to have your cake and eat it too. Because your fundamental example here is
explain the hypocrisy.
We want to go, and we want to build social democracy, right? And yet, social democracy is also fundamentally destructive, right? It is fundamentally destructive to the people in the third world. And the reason I have a problem with this is because I believe
do you know
trade.
Why I think that?
I know why you believe it, Vaush, and
why?
Here's why you're wrong.
Can you tell me? I don't think you do.
Because you have this idea, right, that it's always destructive. And I get your point that we can always aspire to do better. But when you describe the idea of cutting off trade, or when you describe the idea of trade being in fact destructive, right?
Some types of trade are destructive.
That to me is really, I think that's a pretty harmful point of view.
Do you think some types of trade are good and some types of trade are bad? Do you think it's possible to delineate some distinction between those?
Yeah, sure. Trade, for example, coercive trade, that would be a problem. Trade imposed by force, for example, the kind of trade arrangements that colonial nations set up by force, that's a problem.
So to bring it back, what about trade?
Generally speaking, though,
what about
trade benefits both parties?
What about trade that preserves a state of affairs which you believe, in your words, is miserable? So even if you don't think the actual interaction, excuse me, I burped, between the IMF and the World Bank and some developing country, even if you don't believe that's a moral wrong, you still believe underlying all of that, there's something unfortunate about that power imbalance, that they have to make that choice, that there's not more autonomy on their end. So what if certain types of trade reinforce that underlying system, that underlying state of affairs?
Yeah, I don't. I'd be curious to know what those examples are when they're not done through coercive means, because generally speaking, trade is something that is done between two parties who consent to the arrangement, right? Assuming that, for example, let me
threat of invasion.
Let me give some examples here. For example, I would say that trade that is imposed, by force or threat of force would be one problem, right? Trade between two parties who voluntarily agree to enter into an engagement.
I think you missed my point there.
They agree to enter that engagement because they believe it will benefit both parties. Generally speaking, the last 30 or 50 years have shown that's true.
What about trade, which is by your definition not coercive, your lunatic definition I've never heard before, but besides that, there are types of trades which reinforce this underlying miserable condition. So examples of this, historically, the US has invaded countries with regards to business interests, but we can speak more contemporarily since that seems like kind of an easy get. There are also incidences, for example, where corporations will only deal in a country if they keep their wages low or their labor rights scant. And even though those exchanges may be they might, nobody's holding a gun to anybody's head that we know
Yeah.
of. The fact that they keep happening means that the only way that country can survive is by continuing to kowtow to that system. Only through a rejection of these trade policies can they move into something different, you know?
Yeah, I don't know what example. I mean, maybe presumably you have an example of this. Because you've started with saying my argument is kind of a lunatic argument. So what is the argument?
Neoliberal reform
What
because
is
of
the-
the IMF and the World Bank?
What is the argument here of a country that has had trade that has been forced upon it, not through the forces I've described it, but wait, force as you describe it, right? Or trade that has been imposed in some way that does not lead to the country benefiting, that was not also imposed through some sort of force, right?
Uh-huh.
So, what's the example here?
Well, I would say that the IMF and the World Bank have had a history of going to developing nations that need that capital in order to keep their country afloat.
Yeah, and Vaush, I mean, that capital, if it were not there for those countries to have access to, the world would be
feel
worth
like you're not paying attention to what I'm saying. So I'm not saying, I don't know why you keep retreating to the straw man. I'm not saying that these countries haven't benefited from their engagement with Western business markets.
Okay.
I'm not saying that. There are certainly countries that have. But we've also seen countries that relied on protectionism to grow beyond what these countries which rely on Western business interests have. We've seen this happen in countries like Singapore or in South Korea, where this very defensive approach to their economic development has led to them being more than just another country that has sweatshops. It's led to them being independent. It's led to them being strong. But that only happened because they weren't locked into the debt cycle. It's an IMF loan that these countries get themselves into. They had to break free of that or not get involved in it to begin with. Now, I like the idea of a world where the countries we trade with do so only because they want to, not because they have to. Is that not a good world?
Sure, but what I'm saying here is that countries do trade because they want to. Like the examples you provided here of South Korea and Singapore especially, which is a city-state that could not exist without some form of international trade. That basically, in that sense, by your definition, right, this is a country that depends on trade so fundamentally. Perhaps they could even say that it's coercion.
I'm not saying
the reason I don't get that, the reason I reject that is so many of the implications don't make sense. Like, for example, the IMF meme that you keep returning to here. It's like you're saying that anybody who signs an agreement with the IMF is basically being exploited and that they are too dumb to negotiate something better.
No. Wait, now you're doing full-on conservative memes here. Hold on.
Instead, these are countries that have agency, right? I mean, these are countries that have agency, that are capable of making decisions for themselves about what economic systems, what economic programs are best for them.
They don't have agency.
And that's what they're doing, right?
Okay, so let's go back to the example. I unironically don't know if you're following what I'm saying here. When we talk about the homeless person who sucks your dick, we agree. Well, I don't think it was good, but you say that's fine. However, there's something miserable underlying it. Okay, so even if we acknowledge, and I don't know why you keep returning to this straw man that I don't like global trade. I've been one of the most aggressive advocates of global trade as a socialist, I think, in the entire online community. I do so more than Bernie Sanders. I do so more than any of the populists who I argue with or against or for on a daily basis. I don't know why you keep returning to that point. Now, with regards to these interactions and the alleged legitimacy or coercive nature of them, I am not saying that nobody has ever benefited from an IMF loan. I'm saying that there are examples we can look at to see that countries develop further if they aren't reliant on that system. Not global trade. Global trade is good, but on IMF loans, neoliberalization, keeping wages and keeping labor rights low. So that's the reason. And wait, because we've been on this entire time. I don't think we've even talked about socialism yet. All of this could be done. Everything I'm talking about could conceivably be done within capitalism. The reason I talk about this is because capitalist countries, market-driven countries more broadly, don't have an interest in facilitating these changes very much because they benefit from them. It is good in an economic sense to have a reliable base of workers that you don't have to pay very much in foreign countries. That's, again, why we export these jobs. So my criticism of social democracy is that while these are certainly improvements to America, that we move in the directions of these Nordic countries, they still rely on systems of economic exploitation, which I'm not comfortable with. I would call them coercive.
Yeah. And so what I'm saying is, first of all, they don't rely on that, right? Their standard of livings are improved, or their standards of living are improved by global trade, but they do not depend, right? Social democracy as a concept does not depend on the idea that the rest of the world must be exploited, right? That's one. Again, I think the information I dropped, National Bureau of Economic Research study makes clear that the United States, for example, which spends 30% or so of its GDP on social expenditures, right? It does not depend on the 2 to 8% of GDP that it gets, that it benefits from, or rather that it has that it otherwise would not have as a result of world trade. So the reason I bring this point up is to say, to push back on your main point that these social democracies, countries with welfare states depend on a fundamentally a relationship of exploitation of the third world. They don't. Instead, what goes on with global trade is, generally speaking, a mutual exchange that benefits both parties in different ways. For example, if these countries didn't have
that premise,
that they don't benefit both parties in different ways.
the idea that that's like the nature of global trade.
Why would countries engage in global trade if they both didn't think they would benefit?
For the same reason a student would suck their teacher's dick for a better grade, because one of them wanted their dick sucked and one of them didn't have a choice. Well, I guess you don't have to get a passing grade in class, but
I mean,
the point is, different people.
I don't know how you can reduce the story of development in the third world to that example time and time again. You want to call me a bad faith lunatic, Vaush? Let's get real here. You're saying that the global trade,
Okay. So
you're saying that the global trade.
Okay, I'm slowing this down for a second. Okay, as much as penis economics is something I would like to hear about, that has been the first hour, and we have 1 hour left. So, would it be possible to move away from penis economics?
Yes, I would like that. It's not so much the dick sucking analogy, though. I seem to be driven to that in particular. It's the idea that like there's no coercion unless there's violence involved. Which again, I've never heard that definition used before. I have heard colloquially coercion used to refer to a wide array of power imbalances and the products that arise from them. I've heard this from not just from socialist or liberal sources. I think it certainly came up. I think in the incest debates Destiny had with No Bullshit or something. The idea of like the coercive force of power dynamics between family members. So when we reduce coercion as a term to exclusively something which is being forced out of another, which I was highly reductive. I don't know how to engage on that level linguistically because it feels like we're stripping ourselves of the ability to describe the nature of a lot of interactions under capitalism.
I'm distinguishing between a power imbalance that I might view as a problem and coercion, which I would view as a worse problem. I don't view power imbalances as coercive. I do view them as a kind of problem, right? I view them as not an ideal, right? But I also view them as something that is also a part of reality and is not something that's necessarily inherently destructive. Sometimes
and it's a problem then. Fine, then it's a problem.
But I've been saying that the entire time. The central point you quibbled with was this definition of coercion. I don't understand why.
No, it's not the definition, it's the concept, because you keep running back to a really, really dumb and reductive analysis of trade relations. So it may be the case that what I call coercive, you would just call like a bad because of power imbalances. But then when you keep going back to the, well, trade is just when two people want to do a trade. That's just what they want to do. What you're doing is you're implicitly suggesting that there isn't a power imbalance there that you would take issue with. You're retreating from the position when it's convenient, like when we're describing the language. But then when you actually talk about the issue, you go back to pretending that the power imbalance thing isn't a problem. That's the problem that I have with your language right now.
The problem I have with yours is that every time I nail you on this point that you retreat from, right? That that our social democratic type policies, our welfare states depend on exploitation of the developing world. You leave the point and you go back to some analogy about coercion or nonsense because you refuse to acknowledge that reality.
To be perfectly clear, that point I'm not too capable of debunking because I'm not entirely familiar. You've provided me research. I'll take the time to look at it after stream. But it remains the case that all of these countries do it anyway. So you could say then that they don't depend on it. They just choose to do it because it's more economically efficient for their own industry.
That's capitalism.
As long as it remains economically efficient for them to do it, they're going to keep doing it. So it doesn't seem like this is substantive criticism of my position.
This is a very substantive criticism of your position because your opinion is basically
out of a conversation that I had with one other guy. Like that wasn't even an argument that I put forward. When I listed my initial arguments, I didn't say, and I believe social democracies are all inherently exploitative. Like it wasn't a central tenet. I'm way more interested in your definition notion of coercion.
This has to be central, because if you believe that that's the case, then basically democracy, democratic reform is sort of a nonsense goal. It's doomed from the start.
No.
We're all going to be monsters any way
that?
we slice it, because our welfare states will depend on the destruction of the exploitation of the third world, instead of being something that we can build in tandem with the developing world through the mutual beneficial relationship of global trade.
An absurd characterization of my position. So, because I believe that market economies exploit an underclass of workers, which historically is incredibly empirically verifiable, I must therefore believe that democracy is a spook and that there's no point to global trade because it's all. I genuinely don't understand what ridiculous views you're trying to ascribe to me here.
You're saying that the welfare state is fundamentally that we can only have it at the expense of the developing world, and that is the point that I am disputing here. That is the point you were making when you say that social democracy depends fundamentally on the on the exploitation of the developing world, right? It depends on brutalizing an underclass, and the fact is that it does not.
Democracy, capitalism.
It is a kind of it, sure.
Yeah.
Like it is an element of it, is a variant of it. There's more welfare programs and things like that, sure.
And is capitalism a market economy?
Yeah.
Okay. And I believe market economies fundamentally exploit economic underclasses. Yeah. So social democracies also would.
Yeah, and when you say that, with respect to with respect to foreign trade, right? It sounds to me like you're saying that we cannot build a welfare state, a prosperous society, unless we simultaneously do harm to the developing world. When in fact we can both trade and benefit simultaneously while building up our own welfare states. And indeed, this is what we've done for the last 40 years with respect to your trade, rising standards of living.
So your argument is that by implication, when I said that even social democracies fall into this trap, this pitfall, that I'm therefore indicating that there's no point in improvement within the democratic system because anything that we arrive at would also be exploitative.
It's fundamentally destructive of other people. To say, for example, to broaden the class of people, right, who enjoy a modern life, right, through the welfare state.
It was a yes or no.
To do that while also insisting that that standard of living depends on doing harm to the developing world. Yeah, that's a terrible argument. How could we ever build democracy? How could we ever build a welfare state if that's what it requires? That we do harm to other people.
A bunch of views that I don't think are necessarily related. I also believe that the existence of a government necessarily entails the exploitation, or at very least the subservience, of a broad population. But I still advocate for the existence and the bettering of a government. So if I criticize market economies for their propensity to exploit foreign workers, or even that they rely on such a thing, I'm not saying there's no point, democracy has failed. What I'm attempting to say, and I think what I've said many times on stream and in videos and everywhere, is that I think that these systems should be improved, not to perfection, should there ever be such a thing, but as much as we're capable of improving it. And I think that since you seem to agree that you don't like power imbalances in trade relations, that you and I would have a similar goal in promoting economic autonomy for the developing world.
It depends, I suppose, on what you mean by autonomy for the developing world. If you mean like autarky, if that's what you mean by independence, then no. I think that seems to be where it's been tried, usually destructive.
I mean autarky.
When you say because you use a word like independence. I mean,
independence, like they're not entirely dependent on sweatshops that are owned by foreign companies to survive. It's like the United States, where we have a lot of power to engage in trade relationships on our own terms because we're an incredibly wealthy and powerful country. I want them to be strong too. But why autarky? Why would that be what you go to?
Look, when you talk about economic independence, right? When you talk about our standards of living coming directly at the expense of theirs, I mean, that's a problem. So if that's not what you mean, if that's not what you believe in, then that's a good thing, right? That seems to me, sure, we benefit, but they benefit too. I mean, the idea that global trade fundamentally does not benefit both parties. I mean, again, apart from examples around the edges where, for example, some kind of trade deal is imposed by force, colonialism, things like that. I mean, generally it benefits both parties. That's why parties engage in it. And that's why it's a good thing that we should encourage. And that's why it helps us, helps both sides, right? Helps the country that is developing use lower costs for labor to attract resources from the developing world, to attract technical expertise and technical capital and industrial capital and things like that. And it helps us with cheaper products and improve our standard of living. It helps everybody. So it's a good thing.
One moment. Okay, so I want you to wrap this up, and then I wanted to move on to another section I don't think was covered enough, and it was one of the things that was brought up by both of you, which hasn't been talked about, because I just want to.
Then I'd like to just say. Okay. Then I'd like to just say a final thing. It may well be the case that these countries have benefited from their engagement with us. We don't have access to an AU machine. We can't peer into an alternate universe where the entirety of Southeast Asia forms some sort of protectionist trade bloc and see what happened then. All I can say is that there is strong economic evidence that there are types of policies these countries can impose on themselves, which seem to lead to outcomes which are beneficial to them but less beneficial for us, because we want from them things which they may not want from themselves, but because we're stronger, we tend to get our way. And I think it would be nice if we lived in a world where they were a little more capable of refusing a good deal.
And I would not argue with the idea that I would love for other people to have higher standards of living, and that they would have more bargaining power as a result of perhaps needing to trade less. But I think that's also something that you only get through development, and development is something driven by global trade. I think that's a good thing. And in terms of the idea of what a protectionist economic bloc would look like, we know what the protectionist economic bloc would look like. We've seen those in history. For example, the socialist countries in the 20th century that formed Comecon and traded primarily with each other, but not to a great degree with the rest of the world.
If you deny that protectionism can have selective benefits for the economies of developing countries,
I deny that it has general. Yeah, I deny that it has general benefits. I don't deny that there are exceptions around the edges, but I would deny that, generally speaking, a protectionist-driven policy, like, for example, when you brought up the United States in the 19th century, protectionism in the United States may have here and there helped. Generally speaking, protectionism in the United States kept the United States poorer than it would have otherwise been. So I wouldn't accept the argument that there are times in history, for example, where we want a lot of protectionism. Right. I would accept the idea that occasionally here and there might be an argument for it around the edges.
That isn't something I have on my dog.
Speaking about history, I wanted to talk about history for a little moment. So both of you brought up contentious points about the other when it comes to this. One, Vaush brought up to Bastiat the idea that in the history of the world, capitalism continues to have certain problems, and in order to strive to solve these issues, we need to go away from capitalism. Bastiat brought up multiple examples of socialist-type systems failing and leading to what he would consider disaster. So when you look at history, what does history make the case for when it comes to an economic system going forward?
Simply put, history makes a case for looking at policies rather than broad ideological descriptors. If you looked at some capitalist countries, you could come to some very unfavorable and disrepresentative conclusions. And if you look at, I'll bite the bullet, almost every socialist country in history, you would come to some very, very negative conclusions about the ability for these countries to do well for their citizenry. What I'm looking to do is policy-wise. I talk about policy. I talk about international trade. I talk about multilateral trade agreements. I talk about unions. I talk about labor standards. And I talk about worker cooperatives. I like talking about things that have empirical backing, because I found that, unfortunately, the past 20 years of the American left has mostly been canter-wheeling about ideological superiority, which I think is very, very dumb. It's entirely conceivable that the worst real socialist country, not whatever the fuck they were doing in the Soviet Union, but real socialist country, would be far worse than an okay capitalist country. We must argue not on titles, but rather on policy. And the policies that I advocate for, aside from the ones that we've already talked about here, largely have to do with decommodification and worker cooperatives.
Yeah, and I guess I would say that I would agree, generally speaking, with the idea that we should consider policies over we're saying purely systems. But what I don't understand about what you're saying is, I agree. For example, that workers should be free to form cooperatives. Workers should be free to, democratize, engage in forming democratic workplaces and things like that. But what I don't understand is, one, why you would say something like, I focus on policies, when generally speaking, all the policies we talked about have been implemented successfully in capitalistic, what we would review or what we would regard as capitalistic countries, and really not in socialistic countries, right? So these seem like, again, if we're talking about capitalism versus socialism, these are policies that have worked, at their best in capitalist countries. Whether we're talking about decommodification in the sense of what I think you mean, right? Removing somebody's dependence from market forces with respect to certain industries, healthcare, and being one primary example, right? I mean, the best healthcare systems in the world certainly are in, really developed countries like Taiwan, Germany, Scandinavia, things like that. But yet these countries still fundamentally operate on a capitalistic framework that provides them with the resources that they can then spend benefiting people's lives. Whereas the examples that I think, when you talk about workplace democracy, I guess the real question to me is whether you think it's something that's good to encourage voluntarily, or whether you think it's something that should, in the final analysis here and there, eventually be imposed by force.
Is it imposing by force for the citizens of a country to vote on a policy, and for that
Yes,
policy?
absolutely. Could be. I mean, if it's, for example, something that is imposed, like segregation, some kind of authoritarian policy against a vulnerable minority, sure, it might be done democratically, but it's still a force. The fact that we impose force after a vote doesn't make it anything less, any less forceful, doesn't make it any less coercive. It's still force.
Sure.
So yeah, democracy itself is,
Then I do believe in democracy, yes. And then the only thing that I would take issue with is not the force by which it's used, rather, but the actual outcomes of whatever it is that's being forced. I certainly don't have an issue with governments using their ability to legislate to change societies. I mean, if we didn't believe in that, then you wouldn't have private property rights to defend any of the investments you hold. Hypothetical, the capitalist, I don't know. Yeah.
Right.
And I don't know, whatever it is I do these days. So we obviously, the issue to me isn't here by force. I would like it if people would voluntarily engage in the promotion of like worker cooperatives. And that's what I do. I talk about them and I advocate for them. And I get emails from time to time from people saying, hey, you inspired me. We're opening a brewery. We're opening a library. We're doing X and Y, and Godspeed to all of them. I think that worker cooperatives are a more ethical form of economic organization, and there's a really strong body of evidence to suggest that they're more efficient too in a lot of really critical ways. Not just lovey-dovey socialist hippy-dippy critical ways, but also in more fundamental ways, like their ability to resist price shocks or their likelihood to survive the first few years of an economic downturn, that sort of thing. So I push for these things. Now, down the line, I would love it. I would absolutely love it if we could get some kind of state promotion of these ideas, like, for example, subsidies, or maybe banks could be encouraged to give preferable loan interest rates to worker cooperatives, because right now it's the opposite that's the case. A lot of banks are unwilling to loan to worker cooperatives because they're kind of considered like an outlandish system, even though mathematically they tend to pay back their returns much more reliably. So that's what I'm looking to do. And if in the long term they become popular enough that we start getting state mandates on that, I think that's lovely. But if it's to happen, it should be from the people, for the people, not because the Vaush party has achieved power and I want to flex.
Well, so I guess there are a few things I'd say about that. First of all, I would acknowledge that there are some, there's some cooperatives seem to have some benefits over traditional firms, primarily related to their ability to withstand pressures to fire employees. Instead of doing that, they might reduce wages. They might do other things to refrain from firing employees. But they do seem to make it a little easier for an employee to keep their job, as opposed to doing, as opposed to a traditional firm, which might prioritize something else. So that's one thing you can say for cooperatives. I have not seen the empirical basis for the claim that they are generally more efficient, but I have seen a basis for the claim that they are sometimes, in certain circumstances, perhaps more efficient. Right? Sometimes I've seen the argument also made that they are less efficient. That seems to be circumstantial, depends on the industry, depends on the particular co-op. But beyond that, while I would say I could understand that sometimes they are empirically, demonstrably better for workers in the sense of, making it easier to keep your job. And sometimes they're empirically, demonstrably worse, for example, in the sense of sometimes having lower wages, things like that. I think the real issue is, to me, I guess how you want to get to them. Because if you believe that they should be voluntarily, 100%, yeah, sure, voluntary, I have no objection to that. In that sense, a worker cooperative to me is just another form of a capitalist enterprise. Sure, it's done, its managers are elected democratically. Perhaps even all the decisions of production are done democratically. At the end of the day, it still operates in a capitalist framework. It still engages and is subject to the same kinds of trade relationships as any other firm. So I've got no problem with that. What I have a problem with is, I suppose, what you mean by state promotion. Now, if you mean, perhaps we might say, well, tax credit here and there, sure, we do that with different corporate forms already. I couldn't give you a real consistent argument as to why that would be right or wrong outside of circumstance. What I would say, though, is it seems like there's got to be a point where you are saying, I mean, it seems this way. And again, if I'm wrong, I would love to be wrong here. But what it seems to be the case is you say at some time down the line, then we get a state mandate. Hey, that's good to me. And that is the problem. Because once you take these worker cooperatives and they go from being basically a naturally beneficial part of certain industries in certain times and places, and you say, this is the default, this is the standard. Well, apart from being, I would argue, a seizure of property in the form of the corporation, the other issue is that in those economies where people try to do this, and the primary example seems to be Yugoslavia, the advantages of the worker cooperative form seem to dissipate because a lot of things don't seem to lend themselves to a worker cooperative. For example, finance capital in such a situation, in such an economy. I can't understand how finance capital, investment capital would be distributed. And indeed, in Yugoslavia, the answer was it was done through the government, right? But the government ultimately, found itself in the role of picking winners and losers. The government had the same economic calculation problem that all the other socialist countries had in terms of being able to decide how to invest best when you take on the role of all investment. And in the long run, it shows politically favored enterprises rather than efficient enterprises, and the system ground to a halt. So that, to me, is the problem with worker cooperatives. If your belief is they should all be voluntary, then I think that's fine. I think that's great. Ronald Reagan apparently was down for voluntary worker cooperatives, right? So I don't know who's opposition, who's opposing worker cooperatives in that sense. But if you are saying that they should eventually, here, there, eventually we force them, that's a problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm okay with people voting for such a policy. It wouldn't be by referendum, but if people start to push for mandatory worker cooperatives, and those are the candidates that get elected, I mean, I don't see any issue with that. Now, what you're saying, so there were 2 points right here. One of them was a moral argument. One of them was an argument from practicality. The argument from practicality is that when you take a look at Yugoslavia, there were elements of the market socialist state which were not optimal, which I agree with. Though there were, to be fair, there were some parts of it that were pretty impressive, but there were other parts that were cripplingly ineffective. I would like to believe that America is not Yugoslavia, that we are, well, I don't know how much faith I should have in the people of this
exceptional,
country.
Perhaps.
Well, exceptional. I live here. I don't know. It depends on how optimistic I'm feeling every day. But the issue with that is that, again, we don't know what problems in Yugoslavia were caused by the elements of the policies they enacted and which were caused by other forces which were mired in the entirety of that country. I mean, they were an autocracy, for God's sake. And second of all, I wouldn't advocate for any kind of blanket promotion of worker cooperatives if any evidence was found that it would destroy certain markets. I'm not pursuing this for like a strictly ideological reason. Economic efficiency is I like my iPhones, okay? And I think that we all do. I think socialists do too, much as they pretend not to. I want an efficient economy because an efficient economy means we have more resource wealth to spread around and make everyone happy.
Sure.
If it turns out there are industries where worker cooperatives will not function appropriately, then I would hope they find another solution. We're never going to know how these actually pan out in a first world wealthy country until we start, fooling around a little bit at the margins, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't. That might take a little bit of selective government pressure, like, again, those subsidies or tax credits, but we'll see what we can do. If it turns out there's a broad benefit to it, then hell yeah, absolutely. You talk about the seizure of property. I don't particularly care about that in concept because to me this is an extension of democracy. To me, the government democratizing these workplaces is comparable, not identical, but comparable to the dissolution of slavery, in the sense that the government is stepping in and they're saying, all right, I get that, quote unquote, this is your property, but vibe check failed.
Yeah.
And we do what we can with that. Now, I do believe that democratic workplaces are a morally important issue. I believe that there are significant benefits to one's personal health to live in or work in an environment where they are a part of it. I mean, I'd make the same arguments there that I make for democratic countries. But again, things have to be tempered with time and experience. So hopefully that's something we can reach out for and explore with time,
So I get that idea of, again, with tax credits and things like that basically we already do with different business forms. Sure. Mm-hmm. What I don't get, though, is I guess there are 2 points you made here. One, the seizure of property. I recognize, again, that you're approaching this from a socialist framework where basically private property has no intrinsic value. But what I don't understand is why you would draw a comparison there with slavery and a worker co-op. in one case, I'm saying that that a corporation, right, that is forcibly democratized by the government, that is a seizure of property. The slavery example, on the other hand, is property that you can't own property, another person, right? That's something different here. Whereas a corporation is just a legal entity, right?
What is or is not property?
The comparison seems very inopposite, and I don't think the idea that what is and is not property. I think people are born fundamentally with human rights.
Yeah,
and
I don't
those basic
disagree
human
with that.
rights, mean that you can't have property in another person. They can't have property in you. So I don't think that's really a fair point. But beyond that,
what society
you
does
made
or
a
doesn't
point that
consider
suggests to
property
me. You made a point to me that suggests to me that in some circumstances, I suppose none of this morality stuff matters, because as long as we have an election, it's okay. As long as we have a referendum, it's okay. As long as it's done democratically, it's okay. And I want to know, how far are you willing to go on that?
Wait, hold on. Okay, hold on. So first of all, to that latter point, I don't think anything is okay just because it's democratic. I just like for my changes to society, the ones that I want, to be done democratically. I think that if an autocrat were to snap their fingers and make worker cooperatives more prominent, that would also lead to a utilitarian benefit in society. But I don't want to change society that way. I don't think that has good long-term benefits. I don't think that's structurally effective. So nothing is good just because it goes through democracy, but that's the preferred way for things to get done, right? And as for the slavery property thing, now I do believe that humans have inviolate personal rights, but what we treat as property is 100% up to the state. Property exists only insofar as one has a certificate and police will come and help you if somebody else takes it. And whether or not we agree with that now, at the time, they did think that slaves could be property. And obviously, I think that was wrong. And I think, and I do genuinely believe this, heart of hearts, that 100 years from now, the idea that a person could own a facility in which they do not work, but in which others work, that to me will seem, again, not to the same extent. Slavery is obviously much worse, but in a comparable way, a similar kind of, wow, we really let people get away with that. There is a fundamental absurdity to the process if you think about it for long enough. The idea that some individuals, I guess the easiest example would be the church, not the Church of England, sorry, the monarchy. They own these vast swaths of land. And the concept of ownership in that respect is entirely arbitrary. There's just these sections of a planet that belong to them, even though they will never visit them, they will never touch them or smell the air above them. These things matter only insofar as we say they matter. And I think that a system where ownership has more to do with one's personal relationship to a property than who bought it first would be a better one.
Yeah, and I don't see why it would be better in an empirical sense. Again, societies have tried to do that. I acknowledge you're not arguing for those societies, but again, empirically speaking, it seems like societies have tried to move away from that sort of relationship to other sorts of property relationships have led to worse outcomes, generally speaking. So empirically, I don't see the support for that. I can see the emotional argument that you might be making that, it feels unfair. It may feel unjust, but I mean, the way it feels compared to the
I think it is unjust. It's not a feeling argument.
It seems irrelevant. In the sense that it is unjust, and basically you're saying that people making contracts with one another, which is ultimately what a company is, a series of contracts that people make with one another, that's fundamentally unjust, it's fundamentally unfair. And again, I don't acknowledge that.
Wait. When did I say that making contracts is fundamentally
unjust?
That's
employment. That's a workplace. Somebody agrees to trade resources for somebody's labor.
You're doing it again. Yeah. This is reductive to absurdity. Just because I think some types of contracts are coercive or exploitative, just because I think some labor relations produce bad human outcomes, doesn't mean that I am principally opposed to the idea of a contract. A market socialist country would still have employees. Though every employee would be an owner in their own right, they would still be an employee, responsible and beholden to the collective interests of the firm they work at. And they would still have contracts. I'm not opposed to this. I want better power relations. I want equal power relations, or at least as close to equal as we can reasonably. The anarchist dream is the dissolution of unjust hierarchy. And while getting to the extreme on that point can get you really far from where we are today, I think that simple steps in that direction now, steps like the ones I'm advocating for here, are practical and honestly not even particularly disruptive to the way we live. I mean, the change from feudalism to capitalism was a bloody, bloody mess, and it left quite a few people dead with black lung, and mistakes were made. I think the changes that I advocate for are generally pretty understated and reasonable.
It depends on the changes you're talking about, Vaush. I mean, again, I guess
But I've said them here.
Yeah, the changes you're talking about in some senses, right? First of all, I like the mistakes were made. I like that. That's a good way to sum up the Industrial Revolution. The idea that okay, sure, hey, let's try and incentivize people to do something. Yeah, that's one thing. That's something that we do in our existing economy, and depending on how we design those incentives and how we respond to the results of those incentives, sometimes that can be a good thing. Sure, yeah. The thing I object to is you brushing off so casually the idea that, look, if we just seize the enterprise and we forcibly democratize it, it's not going to be a big deal. I mean, it's not going to really change.
I really don't think that's a fair characterization of how I've described this.
Well, what did you just say? Here,
methodical steps towards the normalization of worker cooperatives, along with states making like selective policies that can promote the development of them, and then if they become popular enough, we make a move towards democratizing the whole process. Yeah. Summarizing that as we're going to force them, we're going to have the state force cooperatives. I think that's a ridiculous characterization of my
If you pass the democracy referendum and I'm running my corporation and I say I'm not going to democratize it, what are you going to do?
What happened when OSHA was like created? If they pass that, if they pass that, and you're like, I'm not going to stop stacking ladder on ladder on ladder to get up at the top of the warehouse, like. Okay, the government does this all the time. When you live in a country, you should know this. You're a private property guy. When you live in a country, when you pay taxes to that country, you do so with the implicit acknowledgement that you are beholden to the laws of that country. And especially with regards to property rights, which are entirely dependent on our conceptualization of them is entirely a legal framework.
So how have I mischaracterized this then? I mean, I'm saying the government is forcing you to do this the same way it forced OSHA standards. Right. No, I'm not saying I disagree with the use of force categorically, right?
Okay.
Force exists, right? It can be used for good causes and for bad causes, right? And what I'm saying here is you're saying that if I refuse the democratization referendum, you will use the police to force me to democratize my enterprise, right?
Well, yeah, that's how law works.
Yeah, and so why would you have an objection?
Because I'm sorry, because I'm trying to be careful with my language here. Because earlier you didn't think that like a teacher fucking a college student was coercion, but now you're saying it's forced to pass laws.
Gosh, now if you use the police to beat somebody in the face if they refuse to comply with the law, that's force, is it not? It's very clear.
I doubt a person would be beaten in the face for not complying with what are essentially labor laws. But yeah, I mean, sure. So do I support legal ways of making the world better in my eyes through my arguments? Yes, of course I do. But everybody believes this. We believe this with regards to protected classes. The idea that you can no longer fire a person for their ethnicity or gender, race, or whatever, million categories, characteristics. And if you don't adhere to those laws, and if you defy the government, then you will eventually, well, in that case, well, hold on, actually, you don't get arrested for these things. Usually there's a civil thing, but there are consequences as a product of the state's ability to decide what is or is not just. And we do this with a ton of like social progress. I think that referring to it as force, while accurate in a slim way, is a little bit reductive. Does that make sense?
No, it is not at all reductive, because at the end of the day, I think it's important to recognize the reality of state power. And you would do this in just about any other context, I would think. To deny that this is force when the state uses violence to compel you to make a decision as a result of
it sounds like a conservative argument where I would say something like, I think the government is okay to tell corporations that they can't deny service to a person because they're black. And then the conservative would say, so you're okay with using force to silence my free speech. Technically, that's true. What I said is technically me using the force of the state to prevent another person from what would otherwise be a lawful exercise of their business rights. But I think it's reductive because it's trying to characterize my argument as authoritarian, which I believe it's anything but. I'm advocating for democracy here.
The fact that you impose something that is authoritarian upon somebody by an election that they perhaps had the right to vote in, but ultimately lost, the fact that there was an election over it doesn't make the ultimate decision less authoritarian. Taking their property, right? Perhaps even, as is sometimes done in democratic societies, implementing a system of the law that followed to its logical conclusion to lead to somebody losing their life, the death penalty, right? Perhaps it is done democratically, but the ultimate result is still fundamentally authoritarian. All right. So I don't think that it is just that when you do something democratically, it is fundamentally better, right? Democracy does not on its own carry any moral value, right? We have democracy as a tool for achieving ends, greater freedom, greater individual protection for ourselves and society.
If we agree by the
democracy
system,
in and of itself conveys first of all, I'm impugning you because one, you were calling all the things under the sun coercion, but you had a hang up over calling the idea of seizing somebody's property, moving the police
by
force, right? And that's fine. But again, if you're going to duck out of the idea that seizure of property is force, I mean, it's
hold on, wait. No. So to be very clear, I'm not backing out of that. I don't know if you're listening to me. I've said multiple times that I acknowledge that is a term that could be applied here. What my issue with was the characterization, the implication. And you've already said multiple times that you don't have an issue with force being used by the government through democratic means inherently. So I don't know why we're even talking about this. You're impugning me for using a system that you're comfortable using.
Yeah.
Hey, wait. Before we continue, we've been doing this for about an hour and 30 minutes. So I want to let you all know we have 30 minutes left until the debate is over. So if there's any points you have in your back pocket, any trump cards, any of you got pocket sand in there you're gonna throw out there, you got like some brass knucks in your back pocket somewhere. Now is the time to do it. You got 30 minutes left, and I'm gonna go get water. So for the next 1 minute, you gotta say nice things about each other to calm down before we continue. Okay?
Okay.
100%.
You know, Dylan spent the 2 weeks hyping this up. Spent the 2 weeks hyping this up. I mean, come on. I like your new shirt. I think I saw you were selling a bunch of them too, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm selling out. I'm a capitalist shill now. But yeah, it says politics is dumb, but what the fuck does it say?
Very important.
But very important. Yes.
That's true.
Good term.
Here's what I suppose frustrates me about the way you're describing democracy and the way that it seems to me, I mean, you're calling my use of the word force. I think it's acknowledging reality. The reason this frustrates me is thus. I believe that the state should be limited through certain anti-democratic means, a constitution, right? A series of laws.
These were not just you guys saying nice things to each other. I expect
we did say nice things.
He said my hair was nice. I said his shirt was nice.
Wow,
yeah.
That's all. Okay, well,
Dylan, to be fair, I mean, you pumped this up. I mean, this is a hippy dippy championship. I mean, come on.
Yeah, but you could have been like, I love that you're an amazing liar and grifter. You could have said something like that.
Oh, Vaush and I have had some really pleasant conversations. We're trying to give you a good show, and I think we're doing a good job.
100%. You may continue.
So look, the reason this bothers me is I don't view democracy as an unmitigated good. I think democracy in the political sense absolutely is a good thing, especially compared to the alternative, right? And yet, it is not always a good thing, right? It can be used to exploit and to oppress in ways that are so fundamentally obvious. You know, the history of the United States, for example, involves a majority that had democratic voting rights using its power to exercise state power to oppress people. Police in the United States.
I don't think
democratic accountability, right?
I don't think democracy always begets positive outcomes. There was a hypothetical that was brought up. I don't remember the context of it. I don't think it was in my community, but the idea was if you have a worker cooperative, no government, no state, whatever, just a worker cooperative, what would prevent the majority white workers from mistreating or firing the black workers? And it could well be the case that a democratic majority could legitimately produce a racist outcome. I'm not in democracy. I'm not for democracy like in its totality. I recognize there are bad outcomes. I mean, we live in a country where 70 or so million Americans think Trump won the past election. Yeah. I know democracy doesn't always beget good outcomes. He could have well won that last one. But I just, so if we don't have an issue with the means here, then I don't know why we're discussing the means. The means, to me, this is just the best way to do a thing. I mean, better this than any other method, certainly. Right?
Yeah, and I fundamentally reject that notion. I think that voluntary implementation of co-ops is one thing. The implementation by force, by the state, is a problem, not only because of the seizure of property I mentioned, not only because of the empirical results of the closest example we have to this being done in the world, as it exists, but also because I think that the wide-scale seizure of property by the government of the United States or by state governments or whichever government will be doing this is itself such a transgression on liberty that it would really, I think, lead to a government that feels like it can trample all over people's individual rights. I mean, such a seizure would not only violate the Constitution, but would.
But this is the argument that people made about protected classes too, because that was the government imposing laws which restricted the ability for private citizens to use their private property in the way that they wanted. But we have to recognize, and I'll tell you, the world would not be a better place right now if businesses were given the opportunity to opt in to abiding by our protected class statutes. Like we recognize in this case, force is necessary because these are ills that can't be dispelled without, and frankly, after dispelling these ills, we'll find, as we have, that basically no harm was done. Sure, we may have treaded on the private individual property rights of these people.
I don't concede that at all. First of all, the idea that seizing, the idea that seizing all the property would do harm. Now, if you're saying the protected classes do no harm, yeah, sure, I agree. Protected.
No, wait, don't jump ahead of me. There would be undeniable negative outcomes to a mass seizure of property, which is why I'm trying to be very careful with my advocacy here. What about a system by which incredibly preferential treatment is given to cooperatives, and the government says after X year, all new businesses, all new LLCs, whatever, are going to be formed with like a cooperative requirement?
Right. Yeah, that was done. Something like that was done in Yugoslavia, where they said new businesses must be socially owned, right? Must be sort of worker type cooperative enterprises. And what that did was suppress the rate of creation of new businesses. I mean, that was really the problem that you get out of that. You get less innovation, you get less productivity, you get more preference for existing actors, for existing systems, and that is empirically beyond the seizure of property. Which again, I'm not conceding that is just.
Well, that wouldn't be seizure of property, right? That would just be if you only restrict.
Okay, yeah, you're right. In that sense, that wouldn't be seizure of property so much as a limitation to do with your property, I suppose, what you see fit.
But that's why I need that exploratory period. This is the problem that I have. All the worker cooperatives, the world around, are these either we have tiny bistros owned by 14 people, 3 of whom are related, or you have megacorps like Mondragon, which are barely even cooperatives. They're scarcely cooperatives. They toe the line. My problem is that we don't have enough data. And unfortunately, I'm not talking about some little petty civic law here. I'm talking about a fundamental restructuring of how we think about private property. I need data, and I can't just get it from little businesses. I need it from companies with 50, 500, 5,000 people. And the only way that I can get that is by promoting these ideas. Now, I want to make it very clear that absolutely no federal mandate should take place with regard to any of these issues until long after we have arrived at conclusions which could support the best federal action. I would never advocate for just plugging your nose and diving on in. If we found ways to do this in minimally disruptive or in highly effective ways, or even if we just had to take a half measure, maybe only businesses under a certain size, or maybe this or that, maybe minimal ownership where it's not total co-op, but it's like everyone gets minimal input on select issues, something like that. I'm flexible, I'm open, I'm here for it. I love the discourse, but I can't get any of it unless we move in the direction. I want to walk the road,
Vaush, look, I agree that there isn't the data to implement this change by force. The thing that gets me though, that gets me though, is you propose to do a sort of experimentation through perhaps some limited seizures, right? Like, I don't know. Like, here's the thing: there's a Rubicon to cross here. That stuff I have no objection to. I don't even care if it works, right? I mean, that's something that we can think about down the line, but that's something like very different from the seizure of property, and this is why
that can't be done until we know that it would work.
Gosh, it wouldn't matter fundamentally.
If
it would work, we could therefore take everybody's businesses, because one, we know where it was done didn't work, and you're saying at some point
the government wouldn't be taking them. Wait, the government wouldn't be taking them. Just to be clear, right? Be democratizing.
No, when you say democratizing them, right, you are saying they must be taken from the owners and given to worker owners.
Taken from one entity to others,
seizure
but not
of
for
property.
The government. I'm not saying it's not seizure of property. Just when you say take the property, it sounds like the government's nationalizing all of this, which I do not support for a number of reasons. So the only reason I'm saying all of this is to dispel the argument of pragmatism, that I wouldn't advocate for any seizure of property until I felt as though we had the data necessary to arrive at the conclusion that it would be effective and good. What you're talking about now is the moral argument. The seizure of property is an immoral thing. Now, you can alleviate that with policies like what I described earlier. You can alleviate that by saying stuff like only new businesses. You can alleviate that by saying partial democratization. You can alleviate that with huge payouts to corporations. Say, hey, here's your golden parachute. Take 10 million, go. It belongs to the workers now. Okay. There are a million ways that you can alleviate these problems. I'm open to them. But on a fundamental level, I believe our current system of private property ownership is immoral. So I don't care that much. I
So-
think that this is a logistical problem to overcome. I don't think that the seizure of property in this respect is itself a fundamental wrong.
And I guess the thing is that you want to have the state at some point to do some kind of experimentation that goes beyond tax credits and things like that. You want to have a much more hands-on sort of experimentation to get the data that you need. All right. And to me,
Well, like, wait, like
find
what?
that- yeah, like taking, for example, you wouldn't just start by taking all the co-ops, right? You take some of them, right? You take some amount of them, right?
I think there's enough. I think there's enough room for further enterprise in this country that we could rely on non-seizure methods, at least for the short term, at least to
Then-
develop.
Gosh, if you are saying basically, I abandon the idea of seizing the property, then I guess I don't have any
No. Down the line, the government should absolutely. Again, wage slavery, as far as I'm concerned, follows on the same ideological trend of traditional slavery.
Okay.
Again, I have to be clear about this. Not as bad, not even close. But fundamentally, it relies on a power imbalance in order to extol wealth value from the workers who contribute their labor. I don't like that.
I cannot imagine calling power imbalance a kind of slavery. But let's
Well,
get.
you've
past
heard the term
that.
wage slavery, right?
Yeah, to call that slavery again, it is. We're going to go down the coercion road here, but I just don't understand.
We're absolutely going to go down the coercion
I don't
road,
understand the need to again continually use this kind of language. But let's get
well,
back
the term
to
is
point.
the term
Let's
wage
go to
slavery
the
has been
point.
around for like how long is the term wage
and
slavery?
it's a ridiculous point.
And
To make
there's
the
actually a
comparison-
lot of
Well,
really
Bastiat,
salient underlying comparisons. The
When-
problem that you
well,
get with people
I
espousing
was
like
going to
wage
ask
slavery.
Bastiat a question quick. Why do you
Okay.
find the term wage slavery to tick you off so much? What's wrong with the term, Bastiat?
Look, I mean, because we're talking about consensual arrangements between adults, all right? And to call that slavery by default, to say any kind of employment is a form of wage slavery, I mean, even if I conceded to your point, Vaush, that at least some forms of them might be coercive. I mean, you're defining all wage employment, all wage labor as wage slavery, and I gotta say, it doesn't make sense.
Well,
Especially
the goal
when
of the
we've
term
seen-
wage slavery.
when we've seen situations where we've seen economies that have managed to raise wages, improve living standards. I mean, to say that these people are still fundamentally enslaved, it seems
Wait,
like
wait. Be careful with that, because even if you give a real slave a gilded palace, they would still be a slave. Raising the standard of living has no impact whatsoever on whether or not something is or is not slavery. Freedom is the key here. The
Yeah.
term wage slavery has been around apparently since 1836. I didn't realize it was, I assumed that it was newer than that, but the reason why that comparison arises is because if you look at things in a very fundamental level, not with regards to a person's characterization as property, but just on a very fundamental level, the premise of being a slave is you work or you die. Very fundamental. It's reductive even. And likewise, if you were a textile worker in 1872 in London, the premise for you, likewise, is that you work or you die. There are differences, of course, obviously, which is why, and if anyone ever compared wage slavery to slavery in like the severity of these systems of economics, then I would scold them.
Why
for
would
that.
you use
That's
the word
ridiculous.
slavery then, if you're not trying to implicitly draw the comparison?
Because the comparison should be drawn to indicate that there's a coercive element, but you won't agree with that because your definition of coercion defies my comprehension. That's the reason why. Also, it's meant to be what's the term? What's the term when you say something and it's tried to you provoke a reaction? It's
I mean, to use
No.
provocative language that you concede is inaccurate. I mean,
no.
another-
Wait, hold on. That doesn't make it
You're
inaccurate.
saying on the
okay?
one hand, I would never compare it to slavery, and yet I am trying to
didn't
use
say-
provocative language
Wait,
to raise
Bastiat,
the imagery of
I am-
slavery.
I'm again asking if you're actually listening to me. I didn't say it's not compared to slavery. I'm saying that it isn't comparable to slavery in its severity. I said that very
Yeah.
clearly twice.
So then
Now-
you could say something like wage coercion or compulsion, but to say slavery, I
Sure.
mean, why would you use the term unless you're trying to draw a comparison with slavery?
You are trying to draw a comparison.
Yeah, but you
I'm
just
saying
said
the
you're not.
comparison shouldn't be drawn in the severity, that they're not as bad. The comparison is that in both cases, freedom is being taken from these people because they have to work or they die. Now, nowadays, the term is a little bit more muddled because we have welfare states. A person doesn't have to work or they die. You can not work and just live like a shitty existence, I guess, in America at least, because we don't have that. But back
What
when
would
the term
change under
wage slave,
socialism about this
Huh?
situation? What would change under socialism about the situation? You'd still have to
Uh,
work to acquire
well,
resources. If you had a welfare
great-
state, I suppose. I mean, you might be able to avoid that, but you've got the same situation. It's just that now you've got a vote in your workplace that you still have to work at to acquire resources to
So,
live.
a great many things, and I don't know how you can believe that the presence of a vote isn't a significant difference unless you see no fundamental difference between a monarchy and a democracy. I think a vote's actually key. But the term wage slave was, I'm reading this now, was invented by labor organizers, the Lowell Mill girls from 1836. The reason they coined that term was because they were trying to persuade wage workers, not slaves, that really they shouldn't look at themselves as being better than the slaves, because this is a problem we have. Middle class workers will think, oh God, thank God I'm not working at McDonald's, and then wealthy people will think, oh thank God I'm not working as a teacher. What they were trying to say was, hey, you may think haughtily of yourself, factory workers, because you're not slaves. You're really no different. You're the same type of cog in the same type of system, one rung up. So what we should really do is not find a way to keep you a rung up. We should find a way to dismantle the system altogether. So that's the origin of the term. I don't know what you would call the verbiage, provocative or insightful, not or incendiary, maybe. I don't know. But it was meant to bring about an emotional reaction. The term has survived for 200 years, so clearly it has some holding power in our minds.
A lot of, as the right wing proves very often, a lot of inaccurate, ridiculous terms and concepts persist because they're rhetorically effective. Doesn't mean they're in any way accurate.
Well, I don't think. Wait, I don't think that. I don't think you can say a term like wage slave is inaccurate. It's not making empirical claims about the.
Look, I mean, again, if you think it's possible to use the word slavery, right, but not actually imply that you were talking about slavery, I mean,
colloquially, we use the term slavery to refer to lots of things that aren't chattel slavery.
And colloquially,
you can say, like, you're a slave to your work.
I mean, to say, yeah, sure, but you would never use that to then say, hey, look, it's wage slavery, right? Because of this colloquialism, therefore, it is absolutely appropriate.
No, wait, hold on. This isn't, hold on, wait, hold on. You're mixing a lot of things. This isn't how language works, okay? So colloquially, words are what they are. People can say you're a slave to your work. That's not wrong. I mean, you're not literally a slave, but correctness by technicality isn't how linguistics work. If a term serves a rhetorical function that is being used appropriately, or at least it can be used appropriately in that sense. If a person says X or Y is a wage slave, they're trying to call negative attention to the state or the condition of their employment, which I think is fine. I don't think well of the economy as it exists, so calling negative attention to it.
Hey, look, if you want to call negative attention to it, that's fine. But at the end of the day, to draw the comparison between wage labor made by parties who are consenting to transaction, to draw the comparison between that and slavery, particularly the chattel slavery of the time, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, I think it
makes sense. I mean, again, we're not
use
saying
that kind of language to therefore back up the idea that, hey, look, at some point down the line, right? At some point down the line, hey, look, this private property is unjust, and we're going to take it.
Well, we don't need the term wage slave to. Okay, then I'll make my final statement. We don't need the term wage slave to arrive at the conclusion that there are instances where the state seizing property is just. Whether people like to post hoc moralize it or not, people thought slaves were property. The government stepped in, the government said no, and we're all better for it. I do believe that that was ultimately justified because it was done in the service of freedom. Not that black people ended up having the best lives ever in America after slavery ended, but it was better than slavery, and it was only through the power of the state that that final change was able to be made, in the way that it was, at least. I don't think there's anything wrong with that process as long as you have a democratic consensus and the outcome you're arriving at is positive. I think there are a million ways you can make the changes that I want to make to the world, and I would never be so arrogant as to assume that I can make those changes without needing more ground, more time, more space, more data to develop the understanding of these issues that I would like to have. That's what I want for all of us, not just me, not just socialists. I want all Americans, all people, to be more willing to explore alternatives to the systems they live in. That's what we did with gay marriage and weed, after all. It gets legalized in one state or another. You get these little tastes, and then eventually, nationally, people become more amicable to it. We may even see a world where private property owners are themselves amicable to the idea of cooperative spreading, not because they personally would benefit from it, but because they start to believe themselves that there is a moral imperative in affording people democracy, even in an economic setting. That's the world that I want. I hope we can get there. And I think that among most of those points, Bastiat's going to be an ally of mine, because apart from his perceived belief that I'm like a totalitarian wearing a democratic cloak, I really do think that he is also interested in seeing what cooperatives can do and how well they can do for our economy and our people.
And I would say that, generally speaking, I suppose Vaush and I are, in the political reality that exists today, generally speaking, on the same side. Again, with the political reality that exists today, dealing with the fact that the Republican Party and the conservative movement, the MAGA movement, and increasingly a fascism type movement is the real political threat to the economy, to the country, to the people of the United States. So in that sense, sure, I agree with that. What I don't agree with all right, is the idea that that you can make those comparisons and that you can, especially if you can see that really the evidence isn't there, make a coherent argument for socialism over capitalism. I can admit to a lot of warts under capitalism, and indeed I do. Typically, what we spend our streams talking about are all the ways in which we'd like to improve the system, in which we'd like to do things like, I know you've talked about this recently, housing policy, right? You'd like to make
I would
change
certainly
zoning
love
laws,
some
things
good
like
housing
that,
policy.
right? Yeah, that would be a great thing. Yeah, right on. I'm glad you said that, and I wouldn't have brought that up, but I get your point. So housing policy, all kinds of good things, right? But we've got evidence for these kinds of things. All the things we need to do in this country, right, to fix the problems we have in this country, right, to fix increases in the cost of healthcare and the cost of housing, right, and the cost of education. We've seen examples in other countries where they've been able to do that, where they've been able to do that effectively, and where they've been able to do that without reshuffling society based on theories that have little to no empirical support to them. So instead of rolling the dice, at this time, we've learned some lessons. We're going to do some tests, and eventually it's going to work. Why do that? Why settle for that when we can work on trying to make the world as it exists better using policies that we know will work, rather than trying to I think, build a sort of a society on the hope that it will eventually lead to some sort of a utopia that can be implemented forcibly, but nevertheless democratically. And I will say this, Vaush, I don't think that you intend totalitarianism. Right? I don't think that at all. I'm not trying to say you're secret tanky. What I am trying to say is that I think that a lot of the ideas that you promote, the idea that, for example, anything or a lot of things can be justified so long as they are good and democratic, I think to me that makes very little room for the idea that there should be a space in this society for the individual, that the government should not have a massive sway over the individual, over society, right? That democracy itself should have limits in the Constitution, our set of laws, right? So that the individual's rights are fundamentally respected. And when you talk about democracy itself, democratizing, and minimize the argument, minimize the reality of how state power is ultimately coercive force, that to me suggests that while you are not shooting for totalitarianism, that perhaps totalitarian arguments are easier to make on that basis. So fundamentally, while I don't think your system has an empirical basis, and I don't think it makes a lot of sense, I will say that I think it is a good thing that we at least both seem to agree that we want a broader welfare state in certain ways. We want global trade, all those good things. I just fundamentally, it seems to me like you're basically liberal in that sense, rather than arguing for socialism. You're arguing for a deeper liberalism. That
we've gone 2 minutes. We've gone 2 minutes over.
At some indeterminate point, might someday become socialism.
Okay. So, 1 second, I'm buffering. Oh boy. But we're getting sent. Oh, you know why I was buffering? Because the judges are sending in the votes. Sending them in. We got one.
Who are the judges?
I'll say shortly. We got 2. And taking a while to type. I didn't need a paragraph, I needed a vote. And we got the last one. Okay. So, we have the votes and they're in. It is a split decision. 1 vote for Bastiat from Danabo. 1 vote from my editor, Mr. Geek, for Vaush. And the last vote is from celebrity guest judge Destiny for Vaush, giving it 2-1 for Vaush, making Vaush the hippy dippy champion, Destiny being the tie-breaking vote. Vaush is the inaugural hippy dippy champion. Congratulations.
Well, yeah, I saw the twist coming the whole time, frankly. Wait, in all seriousness, I'll get an explanation on that one later. Bastiat, I seriously do appreciate the conversation. I disagree with you on a lot, but I've found that it sounds so fucking pretentious, Jesus. I found that I have a much easier time formulating my arguments when I'm speaking with people like you, intelligent people with whom I disagree, than, conservatives. It's just better.
Well, I appreciate that. It is good to know that you are gracious in victory, that I'm no longer a bad faith lunatic. I appreciate that. I will say this.
All's fair in love and war.
I will say this. Yeah, it was a good exchange. That being said, I really do appreciate you hosting us here, Dylan, and it was a lot of fun. And Vaush, I really enjoyed that exchange. I hope we can continue it sometime because I think what is interesting about talking to you is that I think you do seem to want to create a better world, and you do seem to be interested in doing things like that rather than sort of, I suppose, building up politics of malice and jealousy, which I seem to get from a lot of other folks on the left. So I appreciate that, and I hope we can talk again sometime. Thanks again for the discussion, and Dylan, thanks again for having me on this inaugural Hippy Dippy Championship.
So I wanted to say thank you very much, Bastiat. Where do you go from here?
Well, I think I'm going to have to figure out how Destiny managed to rig that. I think I'm going to be taking this to court. And I think ultimately it seems to me like the votes were rigged. I don't know how did you count? I don't know if you counted the votes properly. I've heard actually a lot of people saying that Mr. Geek voted for Bastiat, but that the votes were tampered along the way. I look forward to investigating all of this until we can figure out how I actually won the election.
Stop the steal.
Stop the steal.
Thank you very much.
Million judges.
I hate to do this, but I want to have a small interview with the winner. I want to thank you for coming on. And you will now be removed by security, and you will not be allowed to unionize. Thank you.
Take care, Take care, Dylan.
So,
Holy
Vaush,
mackerel.
you are the first Hippy Dippy champion. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I hope you got a generous waistline on that belt right there.
It is quite generous. Very generous. So now that you're Hippy Dippy champion, and you're going to get this physical bet sent to you after it's COVID cleaned, who are you looking at? Who would you want to go against next to defend this belt?
Oh, Jesus. I've been playing so many video games off stream lately. My mind is muddled. Whew, let me think.
You could challenge anyone. They'll surely see
challenge
this.
Anyone. Can I challenge you?
Could you challenge?
Can I challenge you?
Technically, yes.
Okay. You know who I want to challenge?
Who's
no,
that?
I know it. Wait. Can I say a little smaller creator? Is that okay? I can do that, right?
Yeah, you can challenge smaller creator. Sure. They have to make the way up still, but yeah.
I want to talk to Soaked on Left. They emailed me recently, and I think that'd be a fun conversation. I think I want to talk to Soaked on Left.
And what do you think of the surprising vote that Destiny voted for you over Bastiat?
I don't know. It's it's that long term. What do they say? New friends are silver, old friends are gold. I knew he'd come in for me. I had a feeling all of it would line up at the last minute. In all seriousness, I appreciate the incredibly important opportunity to wrap that thing around my waistline.
I'm very happy that you did so. And
can I say something, by the way?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So I want to say, by the way, this is entirely tangential, and I just want to say, I know that you've been roughing it lately, and I mean, I said this to you lately, or I said this to you prior to coming on, but all of the streams monies today, I want to put it towards you for a down payment to a new apartment. Because you are an incredible content creator and an incredible guy. And I think that though I am sparse in the details, what has happened to you has been enormously unfair. And I hope that you can get up and running again as soon as possible.
Hey, I really appreciate that, my guy.